black grandmother was arrested for shoplifting at a boutique. She kept quiet until the whole town knew who her son was. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The wind along Madison Avenue carried a faint scent of expensive perfume and spring rain, brushing gently against the gray wool of Vivian Jones's coat. Her steps were steady, deliberate, as they always were, and the clicking of her low-heeled shoes against the pavement mixed with the distant hum of taxis and afternoon chatter. 70 years of life had not bent her back nor softened her eyes. There was a certain grace in her posture, a poise born of decades lived in silence and perseverance. Her hands, though veined and speckled with age, held her purse with gentle precision. She had somewhere to be. Vivian rarely ventured into the wealthier quarters of the city. It wasn't that she feared them. New York had long ago ceased to intimidate her, but rather because she'd never found much to tempt her within their polished storefronts and sleek glass facades. But today was different. Her grandson, Marcus, would turn 13 in a week, and she had made up her mind to buy him something special, something lasting. A timepiece. Something he could wear into manhood. She had saved quietly for months, setting aside a few dollars here, a few there, even if it meant skipping a second helping of groceries or walking an extra 10 blocks to avoid subway fare. She didn't mind. That was love. The boutique she'd chosen sat nestled between a designer clothing store and a high-end jewelry gallery, its window display minimalist and sharp, with a single watch glinting on a raised black pedestal beneath soft light. As she approached the door, her reflection stared back at her from the glass. A petite woman in her 70s, skin rich with warm tones, eyes thoughtful, hair neatly pulled back into a low bun. She adjusted her scarf and stepped inside. The interior was cool and sterile, with white marble floors and glass cases that looked more like museum exhibits than merchandise displays. 2 employees stood behind the counter, both young, both white, one tapping away on a tablet, while the other rearranged a set of watch stands. Neither looked up immediately. Vivian approached the nearest case, her gaze scanning the rows of watches beneath the glass. She found one, sleek, with a leather band and a dark face, just like the kind Marcus had once admired in a magazine. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice carrying the subtle southern lilt she'd never quite lost. The taller employee, a young woman in a cream blouse, looked up. Her smile was automatic, thin, fading the moment she registered the customer before her. "Yes," she replied, her tone flat. "I was wondering if I could take a look at this one here, for my grandson." The woman hesitated, then circled the counter with a forced briskness. Her name tag read S. Mason. She leaned over the case and unlocked it, sliding it open with practiced hands. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Vivian blinked. "An appointment?" "No, I wasn't aware that was required. It's not strictly required, but most of our clientele usually book ahead." "I see," Vivian said, her voice calm. "I won't take long." Mason picked up the watch and held it between 2 fingers, dangling it as if wary of fingerprints. She laid it on a velvet cloth atop the counter. Vivian reached out and gently picked it up. It felt heavier than she expected. Sturdy, reliable. She smiled. "Would you like me to check the price?" the employee asked, already turning back toward the register. "No, thank you. I can see it right here." Vivian examined the small price tag. $375. She could afford it, barely, but it would be worth it. She pictured Marcus's face when he unwrapped it, imagined the way his eyes would light up. She looked up again to find the young woman watching her, arms crossed. "I'll think about it," Vivian said, setting the watch back on the cloth. "May I see that one, too?" She pointed toward another display across the room. The woman hesitated, then she turned to her coworker. "Can you get me the keys to the back case?" The man handed them over, shooting a look at Vivian. Quick, appraising, unreadable. As Mason unlocked the second case, Vivian stepped aside to make room. Her foot brushed lightly against the base of the first display, and the watch she had just set down slid half an inch. It made a faint sound, just a whisper of contact against the glass. Mason's head snapped up. "Don't touch anything else," she said sharply. Vivian turned, confused. "I beg your pardon?" "I saw you put something in your bag," Mason said, voice louder now. "I did no such thing. You moved closer to the case while I was turned around. You took something. Empty your purse." The room grew still. The male employee straightened. Vivian stared, unblinking. "I most certainly will not," she said. "That's absurd. I'm calling security. I haven't stolen anything." But Mason was already dialing. Her voice sharpened as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, I have a shoplifter here. Elderly woman, African American, short hair, refusing to cooperate." Vivian's chest tightened. The accusation, like a cold hand, gripped her lungs. But she said nothing. "Don't go anywhere," Mason said, as if she might run. Vivian stood rooted. 2 security guards arrived first, followed moments later by 2 police officers, 1 male, 1 female. The situation escalated quickly. Words like probable cause, surveillance, and refusal to comply flew through the air. Vivian tried to speak, but her voice was lost beneath their commands. One officer, taller and broader than the other, asked her to hand over her purse. She refused. They insisted. Hands took her by the arms, not roughly, but with finality. Cuffs clicked around her wrists. As they guided her toward the exit, she caught her reflection again in the glass of the boutique's door. Her scarf was askew. Her coat had bunched at the shoulders. Her chin lifted just slightly. Crowds had gathered. Phones were out. She saw one woman whispering to her companion, lips pursed. Another shook her head. She thought of Marcus. She thought of her son. As they opened the door and stepped into the daylight, the officer behind her said something unintelligible into his radio. Vivian turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Mason's one last time. "You don't know who I am," she said quietly, "but that's not important." Then they placed her into the back of the squad car and shut the door. The city resumed its rhythm as if nothing had happened. The back seat of the patrol car was narrower than Vivian expected. Her knees touched the barrier that separated her from the officers in front, and the cold plastic of the seat pressed against her back. The hum of the city was muffled behind the glass, replaced by the quiet murmur of radio dispatches and the occasional honk outside. She didn't ask where they were taking her. She didn't need to. She had lived in this city long enough to recognize its procedures, its protocols, its patterns. She had seen too many others endure them. This time it was her. The cuffs around her wrists had left faint indentations, but she didn't complain. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, palms turned up as though in offering, as though surrendering to something ancient and familiar. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up decades ago, buried somewhere between the loss of her husband and the long, sleepless nights, scrubbing floors while her son slept in the next room. There was no room for self-pity, only patience, only silence. At the precinct, the process unfolded with machine-like detachment. A woman at the intake desk asked her name without looking up. Vivian answered softly. Her voice was measured, low, not out of fear, but out of principle. She refused to raise it, to beg, to argue. Not here. Not for them. The booking officer took her fingerprints, pressed each aged finger onto the ink pad, then to the paper. The younger officer assisting seemed uncomfortable with the process, offering a few awkward phrases. "Sorry about this, ma'am," or "just routine." Vivian nodded once, her expression unreadable. They took her photograph next. A bright flash, the sterile white of the background, the sound of a camera shutter closing around her like a cell. They placed her in a holding room with two other women, one young and twitchy, her fingers tapping a rhythm against her knees, the other older, silent, eyes closed as though sleeping. The bench was hard. Vivian folded her coat neatly and sat with her back straight, hands in her lap, legs crossed at the ankles. Her purse they had taken. She had nothing now but the scarf around her neck and the quiet hum of her own thoughts. Hours passed. The young woman muttered something about missing a meeting, about how they always pick the wrong ones. The older woman occasionally opened one eye, then closed it again. Vivian remained still. Her mind wandered, but not aimlessly. She thought of Marcus. His 13th birthday was just days away. The watch she had held in her hand, the one she had chosen with such care, it was now just a memory, a moment suspended in glass and velvet and accusation. The door creaked open. A uniformed officer stepped in. "You get a phone call," he said. Vivian looked up. She didn't move. "You want to call someone?" he asked again, this time louder. She shook her head once. "No," he frowned. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He stared at her for a moment, as though trying to understand. Then he shrugged and left. The door closed with a heavy thud. She hadn't hesitated. She had no intention of calling her son. Not yet. Not like this. Not for this. It wasn't shame that kept her silent. It was something deeper, something forged in the furnace of dignity and struggle. She had raised her son to be a fighter, to become a man who stood for justice, who wielded truth like a weapon. He had done that. He had become that man. She would not derail his mission over her own embarrassment. She would not give her accusers the satisfaction of seeing her plead for help. Vivian remembered when Jonathan was just a boy, thin and serious, with eyes too wise for his age. He had once come home bruised after a schoolyard fight. She'd asked what happened, and he told her another boy had called her a name, something ugly, something cutting. She had crouched down, held his face in her hands, and told him never to use his fists unless he was protecting someone. That there were better weapons than rage. He had listened. He had turned those words into a life of purpose. Now, years later, she sat in a jail cell accused of something she hadn't done, and she wondered what he would say if he saw her now, but still she didn't reach for the phone. Night fell outside, though the fluorescent lights inside the precinct never changed. Time slowed. The younger woman in the cell was eventually called out and didn't return. The older one shifted in her sleep. Vivian remained still. In the silence, memories rose, not sharply, but like waves on a distant shore. She saw herself as a young mother, barely 23, cleaning houses in Queens, pushing a vacuum while Jonathan read his library books on the couch. She had saved every penny she could, determined to keep him in good schools, to dress him cleanly, even if she wore a second-hand herself. She remembered standing outside courtrooms in her cleaner's uniform, watching lawyers in crisp suits and polished shoes, and telling herself, "One day my son will stand among them." She had never told him how many meals she skipped to make sure he had enough, how many nights she cried quietly, not from despair, but from exhaustion, How many times she prayed that her sacrifices would mean something. They had. Jonathan had made her proud. Now, to call him, to bring him into this humiliation, it would feel like undoing everything. So, she waited. At one point, an officer returned with a tray of food. A plastic container of mashed potatoes, some kind of gray meat, a slice of white bread. Vivian accepted it with a nod. She ate slowly, without appetite. When she finished, she folded the napkin and placed it back on the tray, then returned to her bench. Midnight passed. She dozed lightly, her head against the wall, and dreamt of her mother. A tall woman with hands like iron and a voice that could calm a storm. In the dream, her mother was sitting across from her, peeling sweet potatoes in the kitchen they'd once shared in Savannah. "You always were stubborn," her mother said with a smile. "And you always said I'd need to be," Vivian replied. Her mother nodded. "Still, even the strongest trees bend in wind, baby." Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but the dream faded. A clang startled her awake. The door opened again. A new officer stepped in, this one older, with a weary expression. "Vivian Jones?" She nodded. "You're being processed for formal arraignment in the morning. Anything you need before then?" Vivian looked up at him. His eyes were not unkind. "No," she said softly. "Thank you." He hesitated. "You got people you can call. It's late, but someone could come get you. Avoid the whole morning court mess." She smiled faintly. "I'll wait." He opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He nodded and stepped back out, the door closing gently behind him. She leaned her head back against the wall, exhaling slowly. She had endured worse. She would endure this, and when the time came, when it truly mattered, her silence would speak louder than any scream. For now, she waited, with patience, with purpose, with the quiet strength of a mother who had already taught the world everything it needed to know. The newsroom lights were too bright, too artificial. Jonathan Jones squinted slightly as the makeup artist dabbed one final touch of powder to his cheek, then stepped back with a practiced smile. He sat upright in the guest chair of the studio, the city skyline shimmering on the digital backdrop behind him. Across from him, the host flipped through notes, nodding periodically as producers buzzed through earpieces and waved behind the cameras. Jonathan's tailored navy suit sat perfectly across his broad shoulders. The lapel pin, bearing the seal of the Civil Rights Law Institute, glinted under the glare of the overhead fixtures. He had done 1,000 interviews like this in cities across the country, in studios small and grand. He had debated politicians, clashed with prosecutors, lectured on cable panels about systemic injustice and institutional racism. Today's segment was about a case in St. Louis involving an elderly Latina woman who had been evicted without due process. The Institute had just won a sweeping motion for a federal injunction, and Jonathan was the face of that victory. Calm, charismatic, unflinching. As the host cleared his throat and turned toward the camera, Jonathan instinctively straightened his posture. His voice had become as recognizable as his face, measured, authoritative, with a cadence that landed somewhere between preacher and professor. He answered the first questions with practiced fluency, drawing statistics from memory, threading human empathy into legal precedent. He quoted legislation, invoked precedent, delivered sound bites without sounding rehearsed. But just before the second segment break, something flickered on the side monitor. A news ticker scrolled across the bottom of the screen. At first, he didn't register it. Then, the anchor's voice faltered. We've just received word that a 70-year-old woman was arrested this afternoon in Manhattan's Upper East Side after an alleged theft at a luxury boutique. Police say the woman refused to comply. The incident was captured on bystander video. We'll have more on this developing story later tonight. Jonathan blinked. He had only caught fragments. A boutique, an elderly woman, 70, Upper East Side. The host shifted back to the teleprompter. Jonathan's mind didn't. Something in his chest tightened. After the segment ended, he stood, smiling faintly as he shook hands with the host, nodded to the producer, and thanked the camera crew. The moment he reached the hallway outside the studio, he pulled out his phone. There was a cluster of messages from his assistant, Deja. One stood out. Deja, Jay, you need to see this. Sending the clip now. Below it, a link. He tapped it. The video buffered for a moment, then loaded. It was grainy cell phone footage taken from across the boutique's large glass storefront. A small woman, dark-skinned, silver hair tied in a low bun, was being led out of the store by two uniformed officers. Her hands were cuffed. Her scarf had slipped from her shoulders. One of the officers gently guided her head beneath the doorframe of the police cruiser. Just before she ducked down, she turned slightly and her face came into view. The breath left Jonathan's lungs. It was her. His mother. He stood frozen in the hallway, screen still in hand, as the video replayed. His legs felt hollow beneath him. The hum of passing crew and hallway chatter faded beneath a sudden roar in his ears. The clip was only 20 seconds long, but it might as well have stretched for hours. His hand trembled slightly as he called Deja. "Where is she?" he asked, skipping any greeting. "She's being held at the 75th Precinct. Charges say attempted theft, but it's thin. I already called in a contact, but they wouldn't release details." "Who filed the complaint?" "Store manager. Someone named Mason. I pulled their business license. They've had complaints before." "I'm on my way," Jonathan said. "I can be there in 20. No, I'll go alone." He ended the call, already walking toward the garage. The doorman barely had time to call his car before Jonathan was sliding into the back seat, phone to his ear again, this time calling a judge he knew on the overnight docket. His mind was already assembling timelines, contingency plans, legal responses, but beneath the analytical flurry, rage swelled like a tide. Rage that someone had dared touch his mother, that someone had looked at her, dignified, gentle, quiet, and seen a suspect, that her face was now plastered across social media, framed by words like alleged and refused. The drive to the precinct blurred past. Neon signs streaked against the car windows. Horns honked in distant irritation. Jonathan's foot tapped restlessly against the floorboard. When he arrived, the officer at the front desk was a lean man in his 40s with a buzz cut and guarded eyes. Jonathan approached the desk, placing his ID on the counter. "I'm here to see Vivian Jones. I'm her son, and I'm her counsel." The officer looked down at the card, then up again, expression unreadable. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Whether from TV or courtrooms, it was hard to say. "She's in Holden. 1 second." He disappeared into the back. Jonathan stood rigidly, fists clenched in his coat pockets. A minute later, a second officer returned, clipboard in hand. "Follow me." They led him down a hall with peeling paint and humming fluorescents. The air smelled of bleach and old paper. At the end of the corridor, a door opened into a holding area. There were 3 cells. In the center, one sat his mother. She was perched on a bench, hands folded, posture as straight as a ruler. Her coat was neatly folded beside her. Her eyes were closed, her chin slightly tilted upward. She looked like she was resting, not imprisoned. Jonathan stepped forward, fingers wrapping around the bars. "Mom," he said. Her eyes opened. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she offered a small, knowing smile. "Jonathan," she said gently, as though greeting him at her front door. He swallowed. "Why didn't you call me?" There was no need. He stared at her, stunned. "No need? You were arrested." "I was inconvenienced," she said. "It's different." "Mom, they put you in handcuffs. And I'm still here." His hands tightened around the metal. "I'm going to get you out, right now. I knew you would, that's why I didn't call. I didn't want to distract you from the people who needed you more." "I need you," he said, his voice suddenly low and rough. She reached through the bars, placing her hand over his. Her fingers were warm, steady. "I'm fine," she said. "I've faced worse." "Not anymore," he said. "Not ever again." He arranged for her immediate release. Bail was waived after he presented evidence of her clean record, community standing, and the dubious nature of the accusation. It wasn't hard. He was Jonathan Jones. Doors opened when he knocked. Outside the precinct, she walked quietly beside him. The night was cool, and he placed his jacket over her shoulders. They didn't speak for several minutes. Finally, as they neared his car, she looked up at him. "You always wanted to protect people, Jonathan. Now you get to protect me." He met her gaze, eyes full of storm and tenderness. "I'm not just going to protect you. I'm going to make sure the whole world knows who you are." She smiled again, quietly, as though she already knew he would. And with that, the son who had fought for so many now prepared to fight for the woman who had once fought for him, silently, with a mop in one hand and hope in the other. Morning arrived draped in a tired gray, as if the city itself bore the weight of injustice too long ignored. Jonathan sat in his office on the 26th floor of a midtown tower, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Below, the avenues pulsed with life. Taxis honking, deliveries being made, people pushing past one another on their way to something more important than the sidewalk under their feet. But for Jonathan, everything outside that glass felt distant, like another world. His mother was now resting in the guest suite of his penthouse, refusing the bed and instead settling into the armchair by the window with a blanket, a cup of tea, and the same quiet strength she had worn like a second skin for 70 years. He had offered her legal options. She had nodded, listening. When he spoke about press conferences and statements, she had simply said, "If you think it's right, I trust you." She didn't want to be a symbol, didn't want cameras pointed at her face or microphones pushed toward her mouth, but she understood what was at stake, and she understood her son. So she let him begin. His office buzzed with activity. Legal assistants moved swiftly between desks. Paralegals printed documents, highlighted witness statements, and compiled data. Deja, ever efficient, handed Jonathan a thick folder labeled Boutique Complaint History, with a sticky note attached. "You're going to want to see this." He opened it. It contained 6 separate complaints filed within the past 18 months, 5 by women of color, all alleging discriminatory behavior at the same boutique. 2 had alleged wrongful detainment. None had resulted in charges or press coverage. No lawsuits had been filed. Until now. He scanned further. The boutique's corporate ownership belonged to a parent company that ran 4 other luxury retail locations throughout the city. The boutique manager, Sylvia Mason, had been promoted from sales associate just 9 months ago. Her file, compiled from public sources, social media, and employee review platforms, revealed a pattern of elitist rhetoric. One former co-worker described her as aggressively territorial and suspicious of anyone who doesn't look like they belong. Another, anonymously, mentioned racial profiling being part of her customer strategy. Jonathan didn't smile. He didn't allow himself satisfaction. This wasn't about victory. It was about exposure. It was about dismantling something that had taken root beneath the surface and grown thick with immunity. That afternoon, he filed 2 legal actions. One was a civil lawsuit against the boutique for unlawful detention, defamation, and emotional distress. The second was a motion to request an emergency hearing to demand the full release of surveillance footage from the store's internal cameras. He also called in a favor with a friend at a local news network and leaked a carefully curated summary of events, refraining from naming his mother but highlighting the case as part of a broader epidemic of racial targeting in luxury retail. By the following morning, the story was everywhere. Local stations led with headlines about the elderly woman falsely accused. Morning shows debated the rise in profiling cases across the country. Social media lit up with hashtags. Videos of the arrest spread. One clip, slowed and captioned by an activist account, showed Vivian's quiet dignity as she was led away. The caption read, "This is what they do to our grandmothers." Still, she refused interviews. She stayed in Jonathan's apartment, reading quietly, tended to a few houseplants he had neglected, and watching old documentaries. When he returned each evening, she would look at him, sometimes ask about Marcus, rarely about the case. Only once did she ask, "Are they afraid yet?" He had smiled then, not with pride, but with resolve. Opposing counsel arrived swiftly. The boutique's owner, a wealthy corporate firm with connections in high places, brought in their usual legal team. Their lead attorney, Philip McKenna, was known for his smooth talking and aggressive courtroom tactics. At the preliminary hearing, he requested a dismissal of the surveillance subpoena, citing privacy violations and potential financial harm. Jonathan, standing in a quiet courtroom beside his mother, countered that the truth was neither private nor negotiable. Judge Anderson, a woman of cautious disposition and impeccable credentials, reviewed the arguments with a meticulous eye. She knew Jonathan by reputation. She also knew the media would dissect her every word. After several tense minutes, she ruled in favor of the footage release. The boutique had 48 hours to submit unedited files or face contempt of court. Jonathan returned to the office that night with more than legal paperwork. He brought a renewed sense of momentum. With the surveillance tapes on their way, he knew the case would pivot from speculation to hard fact. The footage arrived in the form of encrypted files on a hard drive, hand-delivered by a courier from the boutique's law firm. Deja and the tech team set it up in a secure conference room. Jonathan sat with 2 analysts watching the security camera feeds play out across multiple screens. The incident played exactly as his mother had described it. She entered, calm and alone, browsed quietly. Sylvia Mason approached her. Their interaction was brief, civil. Vivian never concealed anything. No item was placed in her purse, no erratic behavior. The footage showed Mason turning her back, then calling security, her face twisted with what could only be described as contempt. There it was, clear as day, the lie. He didn't exhale, not yet. He made sure to download time-stamped clips, organize them by angle and chronology, and forwarded copies to his legal team. The next day, he filed an amended complaint. In addition to the original charges, he now pursued punitive damages for malicious prosecution. He also included a formal petition to investigate the boutique's pattern of discrimination, citing the 5 previous complaints. He scheduled a press conference for Friday morning. He didn't tell his mother. When Friday came, he stood on the steps of the courthouse, a podium in front of him. Reporters gathered like birds around a feed. Flashbulbs popped. The city's low clouds cast everything in a muted silver glow. "My name is Jonathan Jones," he began, his voice calm and clear. "And I stand here not only as a civil rights attorney, but as the son of a woman whose dignity was violated, whose truth was questioned, and whose strength was underestimated." He spoke of patterns, of bias, of everyday injustice. He read quotes from the boutique's own former employees. He showed a still frame of the surveillance video with the time code burned into the corner. He spoke without rage, but every word was fire. Questions flew at him after he stepped back. Who was the woman? Would she speak? Would she sue for more? He answered none. He left them hungry. That night, his mother greeted him at the door with a simple question. "You said it well?" "I did," he replied. "Then I'm proud." She turned back toward the window. Outside, the lights of the city twinkled like distant stars. Jonathan watched her in silence, knowing the fight had only just begun. The world had seen her now, and soon they would have to listen. The night after the press conference was quieter than expected. Jonathan returned home not to the noise of phones ringing or the flood of emails, but to the soft clinking of dishes in the kitchen and the faint scent of ginger tea. The city hummed beyond the windows, distant and muffled, as if the walls of the apartment had grown thicker in response to the weight of the past few days. He hung his coat by the door and paused, breathing in the silence before walking into the living room. His mother was seated in the armchair by the window, just as he had left her that morning. A book rested closed in her lap, one of the dog-eared hardcovers she had carried with her since before his college years. She looked up as he entered, offering the same serene smile that had anchored his childhood through every storm. There was no expectation in her eyes, no judgment, only presence. He sat across from her, the weight of the day settling into his shoulders like a coat he couldn't take off. She reached for the teapot on the side table and poured him a cup without asking. He accepted it with a quiet nod. For a while, neither of them spoke. The room didn't demand words. It breathed with the rhythm of long-held familiarity, the kind forged not by constant conversation, but by years of listening without needing to speak. "I watched the press conference," Vivian said finally, her voice low but steady. He looked up. "I thought you didn't want to see it." "I didn't say that," she replied. "I said I didn't want to be in it." He exhaled, a small laugh escaping him. "Fair enough." "You were eloquent," she continued, "clear. They heard you." "I hope they did." She sipped her tea, then placed the cup carefully back on its saucer. Her fingers lingered on the rim, tracing it in small, thoughtful circles. "I've been thinking," she said, "about all the things I didn't say. All the things I never told you. Maybe it's time." Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You can tell me anything." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood slowly, her knees stiff, and walked to the hallway closet. From the top shelf, she retrieved an old shoebox, the corners frayed, the lid slightly torn. She returned to her chair, placed the box in her lap, and opened it. Inside were clippings. Yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, old utility bills. A program from his high school graduation. A picture of him in his first suit, standing proudly beside her in the church parking lot. And, in the corner, a bundle of envelopes tied with a worn red ribbon. I kept every piece of proof I ever had that we were moving forward, she said, lifting a newspaper clipping. This one was from the day you got your scholarship to Howard. I bought 3 copies. I wanted to believe if it was printed, it was real, that you wouldn't be taken from me, that the world would see your name and let you in. He reached for the clipping, fingers brushing hers. The headline read, "Local Teen Wins Prestigious Academic Scholarship." Beneath it, a grainy photo of him smiling awkwardly in a too large blazer. "I didn't know you saved all this," he murmured. "I saved everything," she said, "because I was terrified that one day someone would say you didn't belong, that someone would look at you the way that woman looked at me in that store. And I wanted to have something to fight back with." He nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat. "I never told you," she continued, "about the nights I sat up sewing your clothes so you'd look sharp at school, or how I sometimes skipped meals when groceries ran low, or how I worked weekends cleaning offices just to keep the electricity on when you were too young to notice." "I wish you had told me," he whispered. She smiled gently. "You were a child. It wasn't your burden. My job was to carry it until you were strong enough to carry your own." He looked away, blinking against the sting in his eyes. "There's more," she said. "Things I held back even from myself." She reached into the box again and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, old and creased. She opened it slowly, revealing a letter. He recognized the handwriting instantly. His own, from his first year of law school. The words were filled with urgency, dreams, and a fierce determination to prove himself. "I used to read this when I felt like I couldn't go on," she said. "When I wondered if I'd done the right thing keeping you in this city. When I was afraid you'd forget me once you stepped into that world of courts and chambers, but you didn't. You brought me with you, even when you didn't realize it." Jonathan reached for her hand and held it tightly. "You were never a burden," he said. "Everything I am, everything I've done, it all started with you. You didn't just carry me, you built me." She looked at him then, her eyes shining. "I want you to win this case," she said, "but not for me. I'm 70 years old. I've lived a life. I want you to win it for the women who are still afraid to walk into those stores, for the grandmothers who don't have lawyers for sons, for the ones whose silence gets buried and forgotten." "I will," he said. "You'll have to dig deep," she warned. "They'll come after you. They'll try to smear your name, twist your words, make it about everything except what it really is. I know. They'll ask why I didn't shout, why I didn't protest. They'll say I didn't look scared enough, that I didn't act the way a victim should act." He nodded. "And when they do, you look them in the eye and tell them I didn't need to scream because you were already shouting for me." He closed his eyes briefly, the force of her words washing over him like a tide. She placed the letter back into the box, tied the ribbon again, and set it aside. "Whatever happens next," she said, "don't let them make you small." He stood, crossed the space between them, and embraced her. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, the beat of his heart steady and strong. "You gave me my name," he said. "Now I'll make sure the world never forgets it." The apartment was silent again, but it was no longer heavy. The air felt lighter, like something old had been lifted. The city lights outside blinked like fireflies in the dark, bearing witness to a quiet promise between a mother and her son. That night, he slept less, not from restlessness, but from clarity. The strategy that would follow, the depositions, the subpoenas, the courtroom maneuvers, would be grounded in more than law. It would be rooted in her stories, in the sacrifices she had never once used as currency, in the power of all she had held in silence. And when morning came, he would rise to meet them all. The morning of the trial dawned cold and bright, as if the city itself had been scrubbed clean overnight in preparation for something it did not yet understand. Jonathan stood by the window of his office, watching the sun crest over the rooftops, its light falling in long, silent bands across the neighboring buildings. The conference room behind him was already alive with movement. Paralegals shuffled papers, assistants checked file folders and printed transcripts. Deja was at the long table, methodically reviewing the final set of exhibits, her glasses perched at the end of her nose, lips pressed in a firm line. The team was sharp, focused, and ready. But even in the whirl of precision, Jonathan felt the quiet weight of what the day would mean, not only to him, not only to his mother, but to every person who had been told, in ways loud or subtle, that they did not belong. He had dressed in silence that morning, his suit carefully chosen, a dark charcoal with a crisp white shirt and silver tie. Not too bold, not too soft. He wanted to be steel, but not ice. When he entered the living room, his mother was already up, seated in her usual place by the window. She wore a dark blue dress, simple but elegant, with a small gold pin at the collar that had once belonged to his grandmother. Her hair was neatly brushed, pulled back with quiet grace. She looked at him for a long moment and nodded. "You'll speak truth," she said, as though it were not a question but a given. "I will," he replied. They arrived at the courthouse just past 9. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, reporters, activists, curious onlookers. Police maintained a light perimeter, and cameras hovered like insects, buzzing at the edges of the steps. As Jonathan stepped out of the car, microphones surged forward. Voices called his name, but he didn't pause. His mother followed behind him, upright and calm, eyes fixed ahead. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity. The walls, paneled in dark wood, seemed to hum with tension. Judge Anderson presided from the bench, her robe immaculate, her expression impassive. She glanced over her glasses at the attorneys, then at the gallery, where every seat had been filled. Along one side sat the boutique's legal team, flanked by the defendant, Sylvia Mason, her lips tight, posture defensive. Along the other, Jonathan and his team arranged their materials. Vivian sat in the front row behind him, a folded handkerchief in her hands, not for tears, but as something to hold, something to root her to the moment. Judge Anderson called the court to order. The prosecution's opening statement came first. McKenna, the boutique's lead attorney, strode confidently to the center of the courtroom. He was polished, practiced, every gesture measured. He painted a picture of a misunderstanding, of routine security procedure, of a small event blown out of proportion by media frenzy. He referred to Vivian as the individual in question, never by name. He gestured to Mason as a longtime employee following company policy. He called the arrest unfortunate, but within bounds. When it was Jonathan's turn, he stood slowly, deliberately. He walked to the same spot and let the silence settle before he spoke. "My client's name," he said clearly, "is Vivian Jones. She is a 70-year-old woman, a mother, a grandmother, and a lifelong resident of this city. She entered a store to buy a gift for her grandson. She left in handcuffs." He turned toward the jury. "This case is not about a misunderstanding. It is not about protocol. It is about a pattern of looking at someone like Vivian and seeing not a customer, but a suspect. Not a grandmother, but a threat." He let the words hang in the air before continuing. You will see the footage. You will hear the testimony. And when you do, I ask that you not look away, because what happened to Vivian Jones could happen to any woman who walks through those doors wearing the wrong color skin. Witnesses followed. The first was a former employee of the boutique, a young black woman named Renee Parker. She testified to a culture of quiet discrimination, to whispered instructions about who to watch, to forms that were filled out selectively. She described Mason's behavior in detail, her offhand remarks, her discomfort around certain clientele. Next came the security expert who had reviewed the footage. He explained the angles, the timestamps, the absence of any evidence of theft. The video played for the courtroom projected on a screen large enough for every eye to see. Vivian appeared, small but composed, moving through the boutique with the same care she carried everywhere. No sudden movements, no concealment, only browsing, a few words, and then an accusation. Gasps rippled through the gallery when Mason's call to security played out in her own voice, strained and falsely urgent. The juxtaposition of her tone against the footage was damning. Mason herself took the stand on the second day. McKenna guided her gently through her version of the events, emphasizing her concern for merchandise, her training, her years of service. She insisted she had followed protocol, that she had genuinely believed something had been taken. Then Jonathan rose for the cross-examination. He approached slowly, never raising his voice. Miss Mason, you say you saw Mrs. Jones conceal an item in her bag. Is that correct? I thought I saw something, yes. But you didn't check the footage before calling security. I didn't have time. You didn't ask Mrs. Jones any questions about the item before calling? No. Did she attempt to leave the store? No. He paused. Do you know how many times in the past year you called security for suspected theft? She fidgeted. I don't recall. Would you be surprised to know it was 9 times? And that in 7 of those the customer was a woman of color? Objection. Sustained, the judge said. Counsel, move on. Jonathan nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. The final day of testimony came with the question hanging over the room. Would Vivian speak? He had asked her more than once. She had said she would decide when the time came. And now the time had come. She rose from her seat without being called. The courtroom hushed. The judge, surprised, leaned forward. Miss Jones, she said, are you prepared to testify under oath? I am, she replied. She took the stand. The clerk swore her in. She sat, small and calm, behind the microphone. Jonathan approached, his voice soft. Mrs. Jones, can you tell us what happened that day? I walked into a store, she said. I wanted to buy a gift. I was followed, watched, judged, and then I was accused. Did you take anything? No. Did you speak to the employee? I asked to see a watch. What happened next? She accused me, loudly, in front of everyone. Were you angry? No. Why not? Because anger was what they wanted. I've lived long enough to know that my voice, raised, is seen as threat, so I stayed silent. He paused. Why are you speaking now? She looked at him, then turned her gaze to the jury. Because my son taught me that silence isn't always strength, that sometimes dignity must be defended, not for yourself, but for those who come after you. Jonathan's throat tightened. He nodded, stepped back. The courtroom was utterly still. In closing, McKenna tried to rally, but the momentum was gone. The footage, the testimony, the quiet power of Vivian's voice. It all remained, impossible to unsee, impossible to unhear. Jonathan's closing statement was brief. You have seen what bias looks like. You have heard what silence sounds like. And now it is your turn to speak. Not with words, but with justice. Deliberation took less than 2 hours. The jury ruled in favor of Vivian Jones on all counts. Applause broke out in the courtroom, restrained at first, then growing. Judge Anderson banged her gavel for order, but her mouth twitched with the faintest hint of something like approval. Outside, the press surged forward again. Jonathan shielded his mother as they walked through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Vivian paused on the steps just briefly and looked out at the sea of faces. She said nothing, but she didn't have to. The world had finally listened. The sun was bright on the courthouse steps, too bright, as if the day had conspired to witness a quiet revolution. Photographers clicked their shutters in rapid succession. Reporters leaned in with mics raised like weapons, and the crowd that had gathered outside now swelled with applause and murmurs of something more than victory. It was recognition. It was reckoning. But Vivian didn't pause for long. She gave no interviews, made no statements. She walked steadily down the steps beside her son, her chin lifted, her hands steady, her silence louder than any microphone. They returned home in a black car that cut through the city like a blade. The windows were tinted, but even through the glass, people looked in, as though sensing that something inside had changed the shape of the day. Jonathan sat beside her, quiet, one hand on his knee, the other pressed against his mouth in thought. He had spoken for her in court, yes, but it was her voice that echoed now across headlines and press briefings, across social media feeds and quiet living rooms where grandmothers watched and nodded without saying why. At the apartment, she removed her shoes by the door and placed them side by side. The television was on, muted, with her image plastered across every channel. Headlines called her the dignified plaintiff, the grandmother who stood tall, the face of quiet resistance. Jonathan turned the volume down further until only the image remained, a silent loop of her walking, her sitting, her looking into the camera during her testimony, eyes calm, jaw set. "I'm going to make tea," she said simply, stepping into the kitchen. Jonathan didn't stop her. He knew that was her way, her method of reclaiming normalcy. While the world tried to sculpt her into a symbol, she grounded herself in the ordinary, in the rituals of care. He watched her pour water, set out the cups, stir in honey. She didn't speak of court. She asked if he wanted a biscuit with his tea. He said yes. It wasn't until late that evening that she allowed herself to watch one of the interviews. A respected evening anchor, gray-haired and soft-spoken, addressed the camera with rare gravitas. Behind him was an image of Vivian on the witness stand, a still from her testimony. Today, in a case that captured national attention, a 70-year-old woman named Vivian Jones was awarded damages in a lawsuit that has already begun to reshape conversations about bias, retail discrimination, and quiet resistance. What began as a routine store visit became a moment of cultural self-reflection. But who is Vivian Jones? The question hung in the room. Vivian sipped her tea. She has declined all interviews, the anchor continued, but her story has already spread. In churches, in classrooms, in living rooms, people are saying her name. They're saying it with reverence. Jonathan watched his mother closely. She didn't react, but her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her cup. "I didn't want this," she said at last. "Not like this." "I know," he said. "I didn't want my name to be remembered because someone mistook me for a thief." He nodded. "But it's not why they remember it. They remember it because you didn't flinch, because you didn't shrink, because you told the truth without anger, because you were exactly who you are." She was quiet a moment. "It's strange," she said, "to live your whole life in the margins, then wake up one day and find yourself in the center of something." "You've always been the center," he replied. "It just took the world a while to catch up." The following week was a whirlwind. Jonathan announced the creation of a new legal fund dedicated to defending elderly women of color who faced discrimination. The press conference was held not on courthouse steps, but in a modest community center in Harlem, where folding chairs and hand-painted signs offered a different kind of dignity. The fund would be called the Vivian Jones Justice Initiative. She hadn't agreed at first. She said her name didn't need to be attached to anything. She said the work mattered more than the credit. But Jonathan insisted. "Your name is more than yours now," he said. "It's what it represents: strength, silence that speaks, dignity under pressure." He took her hand and added, "It's a name I'm proud to stand behind." Eventually, she agreed. The press loved the story. Donations poured in. Celebrities tweeted their support. Activists called it a long overdue acknowledgement, but more meaningful than the headlines were the letters, hundreds of them, from women who had walked into stores and been watched, from grandmothers who had been told they didn't belong, from daughters who had never seen someone like their mother stand tall in court. One letter came from a 12-year-old girl in Atlanta who wrote in a careful cursive, "Dear Mrs. Jones, when I saw you on TV, I told my teacher I wanted to be brave like you. I used to think I had to yell to be heard. Now I know I can be still and still matter." Vivian read the letters slowly, one by one, sometimes rereading them, her lips moving silently over the words. She never cried. She only nodded, folded each letter neatly, and placed it in a small wooden box Jonathan had bought for her. One day, she asked to visit the store. Jonathan hesitated. "You don't have to go back there." "I know," she said, "but I want to see it again. Not for them, for me." He arranged a private visit early in the morning before opening hours. The boutique had changed. New signage, a new manager, new staff. The interior had been redesigned. A diversity pledge hung on the wall near the register. She walked slowly through the space, pausing at the watch display. The item she had wanted to buy was no longer there, replaced by a newer model. She looked at it, then turned away. On the way out, she left a note on the counter. Not for the staff, not for the management, for the space itself. It read, "I was here. I did not leave empty-handed." Later that evening, she returned to her home in Queens. She had decided it was time. The house had been untouched for weeks, but the furniture greeted her like old friends. She moved through the room slowly, her fingers brushing along bookshelves, doorknobs, curtain rods. She unpacked her bag, put her clothes back in drawers, returned her shoes to their rightful place. Then she stood by the front window, looking out at the street she had walked 1,000 times. She was home. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its rhythms. She visited the market, attended church, stopped by the library. Neighbors nodded more reverently now. Children whispered to each other and pointed, not rudely, but with awe. Her name had become something sacred. One Sunday, her grandson, Marcus, stood in front of his classmates to read a school essay. The assignment had been simple: write about someone who inspired you. He held his paper with both hands, voice clear and proud. "My grandmother's my hero," he began. "She didn't lift weights or fly planes or write books, but she stood up when others would have sat down. She stayed calm when the world wanted her to break. She taught my dad to fight with words instead of fists and he taught me to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Her name is Vivian Jones. And now everyone knows it. But I've always known. In the back of the classroom, Vivian sat next to Jonathan. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Later that evening, as she sipped tea by her window, Vivian thought of all the names the world had forgotten. All the women who had come before her, who had endured in silence, whose strength had gone unnoticed. She whispered their names into the quiet, honoring each one. Then she whispered her own. And this time, it rang. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more, check out the next video and explore the others on the channel.